I'm delighted to be introducing Susan. As you know, Susan is Director of the Centre for Longitudinal Research at the University of Auckland and Foundation Director of Growing Up in New Zealand, which she's led since its inception. And her background is as a public health physician and Lifecourse epidemiologist. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Susan's insights into the research policy relationship. So over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma, and everybody can hear. If there are any issues, please just use the chat function. Otherwise, we'll get started. So it's really my pleasure as well to speak to you about some of the insights that we've had from growing up in New Zealand. And what I'm going to do is to talk firstly about some of the challenges that we face in general for any sort of research, but particularly for longitudinal research, in terms of how we translate findings to inform policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the utility of longitudinal studies like growing up in New Zealand. Obviously, that's the one that I'm familiar with. And then Emma will speak to some examples from Ireland as well. I'll talk a little bit as I go through about how important partnerships are throughout the whole sort of process of facilitating policy translation. And then very briefly, just present two case studies using the growing up in New Zealand evidence. One that is about co-designing solutions with communities, and the second one that goes to the other extreme, that's really about informing the whole of government about evidence that hopefully can be used to inform policy. I'm going to try this one again. There we go. So I guess the first thing is, why on earth is it so hard when we do what we think is good research, but it actually takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of persistence really to translate evidence into the sort of information that can be used to inform policy. And I guess reflecting on it, it's really because when we think about our research methods, we're really, really good at understanding risk factors. We're very good at understanding single outcomes, and we're very good at using statistical techniques to understand the sort of relationships between those risk factors and outcomes. But unfortunately, no matter how strong associations may be in those sort of research analyses that we undertake, strong associations on their own are not enough to demonstrate causality. And there are other things that are going on that if we're thinking about what to do about problems, we need to understand. So basically in the real world, causation is often not just due to the risk factors we're measuring. It can be due to many other things that we perhaps haven't considered. Some of the risk factors that we might be looking at may well be proxies for what's actually behind the sort of issues that the determinants of the sort of outcomes that we're interested in fixing. And often the outcomes themselves are part of comorbidities. So it's not really a one-to-one relationship. And so there are real issues for us in terms of how we use robust scientific evidence and translate that into information that can be used at the policy table. So that's something that is problematic. Also, really big and really problematic in this space is, of course, the whole translation of evidence from robust research findings into policy is not a linear process. And this is a rather nice cartoon, I suppose, of the sort of processes that go on in terms of taking evidence from all sorts of different areas and then making decisions that are policy relevant or policy based, and then eventually things that might have impact in terms of actually changing outcomes. And in the case of what we're doing, improving well-being of populations. And as you can see, the issue is that even if we think we have the very best research findings, translating those and taking those to policy tables can be very challenging because of all the different sort of parameters that go into making a policy decision. So there are biases that we will bring as researchers, but equally there are biases that will be brought to the table by policymakers, and they will be very much driven by values and by the voters and by fiscal constraints and many, many other things that will inevitably determine whether the evidence that we might want to bring to the table can actually help to inform any change in strategies. So, I mean, even if we think about some of the simplest examples like smoking and the evidence that linked smoking to lung cancer, I mean, it took 50 years before we actually started to see translation into policy that was actually built on what we would all probably regard as extremely good evidence that there was a link between tobacco and lung cancer in this case, although at the beginning it was thought to be something different. So these things take time, and they take a lot of persistence, and actually what they probably take is partnerships, and I'm going to explore that a wee bit. So what I want to talk you through in the next few minutes is just to give you some examples of how we've tried to approach that using a longitudinal study, in this case growing up in New Zealand. It's a study I obviously know the most about, and so I'm going to use it in the case studies, but there are a number of other longitudinal studies as well as other pieces of research that we could use in this space. Just very briefly, the Growing Up in New Zealand study is a study that's been going for over 10 years now. It recruited nearly 7,000 children in pregnancy via their pregnant mums and also with their partners. The cohort was specifically designed to represent the current births in New Zealand, and that was really important for informing policy because we actually wanted to be able to generalise the results that we could find from following these children in the context of their families to all births and all young children in New Zealand today. So that's something that we were able to demonstrate. And most importantly, I suppose, and relevant to today, is that from the beginning, this study was explicitly designed to provide evidence that could be used to inform cross-sectoral policy, and not only about what doesn't work, but actually what might work to improve wellbeing. And that's really because despite the fact that we all think New Zealand is a lovely place, and it is, and a great place to raise children, some of the statistics internationally would tell us that actually that's not the case. Our children don't do very well in international comparisons of wellbeing, and we see vast inequities in our outcomes within our population, and that's something we wanted to really understand better. So in terms of trying to find a framework that would address those inequalities in health and help us understand and provide evidence for policy, we have this double puddle model. We put the children at the centre, but we recognise that they are inevitably, their development is shaped by the interaction with multiple of other environments around them, from the family all the way up to the policy environment. And we were particularly interested in this study to understand why we saw such a gap between well-intentioned policy level information at the national level usually, but it could be at the community level, and actually the failure to reach or target those children and families who have the greatest need. And so one of the things, that red arrow that you see on what we call our double puddle model, is really about eliciting what the reason for that gap is and trying to address that when we provide evidence. So in order to do that, the first partnership I want to talk about is a really important one. So rather than wait until we had found the evidence from the study and take our results to policymakers, we actually worked with 16 government agencies from the beginning of the study. So we actually recognised that in order to build credibility, to build trust, and to have a platform on which to take this evidence to policy tables, we wanted to work with our policy agencies right from the beginning. So they were involved in the design, in the processes of data collection, they're involved in how we analyse the data, and importantly in the dissemination of results. So all the way through the process from one end to the other. And that means that actually we're not so focused, we're not very good academics, we don't publish, well, we do actually publish a lot of manuscripts, but it's not our primary purpose. We are more interested in terms of the study in providing evidence that can be used at the policy table. And so we provide a lot of policy briefs, we provide comprehensive reports, and these reports and policy briefs are designed to help bridge that gap, and they are designed explicitly with policy agencies to help them to get evidence that they can use to inform the strategies they want to make in various areas. So I just want to talk about two of those now. Firstly, I want to talk about poverty. So one of the areas that we have looked at from 2014, 2015 initially was child poverty. And of course, that is an area of policy that is highly relevant in New Zealand, but equally as relevant across the globe. And we really wanted to look at poverty, and were able to look at poverty in using the longitudinal evidence more than in a one-dimensional way. So often when we think about poverty, we think about the outcomes of poverty. Poverty is measured at a policy table in terms of income or a financial status. But the advantage of longitudinal studies is we can look at capitals that are much wider or much broader than just those one dimensions. And so we look at poverty, as other studies have, at these different levels of capitals. So economic capital, absolutely, but also physical capital, social capital, and human capital that all combine to determine the environment that a child is exposed to, in this case, in their first 1,000 days of life. So we looked at how these sort of risk factors, which are all associated with poorer outcomes for our children, were associated with their well-being in their very early years. And we actually looked at how those clustered and accumulated. So we weren't just focused on one or two of those outcomes. Of those 12, we looked at how they clustered, and we looked at a combination of them and said, if children are exposed to any 4 or more of those at more than one point in time, so in pregnancy for us, in their first year and in their second year of life, so right across those 3 time points in the first 1,000 days, firstly, what is the impact on their well-being before they start school? So really at the end of their 2,000 days, their first 2,000 days. And what we found is actually that the impact was quite significant, and it was widespread. So no matter what we put as an outcome at the end of this, those children who had been exposed to more adversity were more likely to have poorer physical health at 4.5, poorer mental well-being at 4.5, and equally poorer behaviour, poorer numeracy, poorer literacy, be less prepared for school. Basically every factor we looked at, these children were already falling behind their peers because of this exposure to persistent adversity in their early life. So that was kind of the finding of that first piece of work, and we could have left it there. But actually our purpose was to say, how do we use this to inform new solutions? So we also then went back to that evidence and said, not every child who's been exposed to that persistent poverty actually has poor outcomes. There are some children who will thrive despite those environments that are adverse and that are complex and wicked and very difficult to actually resolve. So we went back to the cohort and we looked at what protected some children, what created resilience. And we looked at those things and said, well, actually, they're quite simple things. They're things like support for families. They're about families' connection to their environments and their feeling of security and connection to services. And we actually took that evidence to the communities that were most impacted by that. So again, a partnership here, not just with the policymakers in this case, but actually taking those results to the communities and saying, this is what we've found using your collection of evidence. What should we do about that? And we work with the communities, we work with people who worked in those communities to develop strategies to say, how can we take some of these findings and build support services that might enhance well-being while we deal with the wicked problems of poverty? And we ended up setting up something called Loud Libraries, which sounds a little bit weird, but it's kind of the fact that we were making a safe environment for families who were otherwise vulnerable to come and gather, to connect with each other, to have services come to them, and to actually enable them to be empowered to provide the things that they wanted to provide to their children, which in their own environments was challenging for whatever reason. So that was one quick case study based on the community. And I just want to talk briefly now about the second case study, which takes us out to the other end of the spectrum, where we actually looked at a whole of government approach and how we translated evidence. So in New Zealand in 2019, some 10 years after we started the Growing Up in New Zealand study, the government has introduced a child and youth wellbeing framework for informing all policies actually across all sectors of government. And in fact, our Treasury now measures fiscal wellbeing or fiscal sustainability according to its impact on the well-being of the population. So everything that every government sector does is based on a well-being measure now. So this strategy, interestingly, matched quite well with the framework that we had set up 10 years earlier. And so we recognised that we could speak to this framework and perhaps give some examples to the government that might help them to use the evidence that perhaps they didn't have otherwise. So this plan, this strategy, has 6 different domains, and you can see here they're represented by different symbols. This is the overview. They're very much strengths-based. They're about ensuring that children are well supported, they're loved, they're nurtured, they're happy, they're healthy, have what they need, connected, accepted, and so on. They are very strengths-based measures. The problem in terms of the government enacting or using these things to create strategy is most of the routine data that's collected by government is actually deficit focused, and it doesn't really speak to these things. So we were in a unique position to say, well, actually, we can speak to these things because we've been collecting information about it from the children since they were born. So at 8, which is the last data collection wave that we conducted and finished in the field, we actually said we can speak to some of the indicators that you were interested in, and you can see them highlighted here in red, just a few of them. And I just want to talk to you about a few of the ways that we fed that back in to multiple policy agencies actually, and the way that those are being used alongside the routine data now to inform what is working for our children and perhaps what is not working quite so well. So the great thing about the children and the longitudinal study is at 8 years when we started to align our outcomes with this wellbeing framework, and you can see those along the bottom there, and you'll see them on the next few slides as well. So we tried to align our outcomes to the particular domains in that cross-government framework. But the great thing is that we had the voices of the children directly. We were hearing straight from them about what was impacting on their well-being and what made them feel safe and secure and loved and connected and so on. So a couple of quick examples. One of the things that we know is really, really important for well-being is identity. So a strong identity that emerges through childhood and goes on in adolescence to young adulthood is really important for people's own well-being. So we asked the children at 8 for the very first time how they identified themselves. And unlike their parents who had told us who they thought they would be and their diversity of ethnicities, the children told us some quite different things. So this is the graphic, the very simple graphic that says how the children identified themselves. A couple of things to mention. One in 7 children didn't even think about it. So they were unable to identify themselves. And those children actually tended to be New Zealand European children, children who didn't have discussions with their family or their parents about their culture. And still others had identified with groups that their parents may not have thought of for their children. And this is going to be something that emerges over time. We had a very strange group called Australian. Those of you who know New Zealanders know that that's rather unusual in the New Zealand context, but a few people decided that that's who they were. Not one of the Stats New Zealand categories of ethnicity, but nevertheless an interesting category the children told us themselves. We could also ask the children things like what connected them to their culture, and language is a really important treasure that is being revitalised in this population. And we had a Te Reo Māori test that we administered to all our 8-year-olds, and we found that in this generation we're seeing a revitalisation of our Indigenous language, of Te Reo Māori, and that's really exciting because that is well connected to children's identity, and those children who have strong identities and strong language skills also have better well-being as they move through middle childhood. The not so good is we saw that 1 in 3 of the children told us they were being regularly bullied. And that is really sad. And actually that was the same sort of proportion of parents had told us their children were being bullied in the preschool years. We're concerned about that in New Zealand because in adolescence, we know that New Zealanders rank very badly in terms of bullying of adolescents. And the shame of this is that we're seeing it very, very early. We could also see that some of our children were recognising bullying in others and standing up for their friends. And so what we want to do with this evidence is rebalance that. How do we help to create an environment where that sort of standing up for people being bullied and recognising it's not okay very early is the predominant feature, rather than bullying being the predominant feature. We could also look at housing quality, one of the really clear parameters that was in the government framework for wellbeing. Almost 40% of our children live in damp or mouldy homes. And we know that because the children went out with temperature monitors at 8 and they actually measured their home and school environment. So we have some hard statistics that back this up. And unfortunately, that was much more common for children living in rental properties. And almost 40% of our children live in rental properties and have done their whole life and are likely to keep living there because our housing situation or our housing property is overinflated, and most people with young children will not get into homes anytime soon. We also saw that particularly for those renting, the housing stability was really poor. So 3 out of 4 of all of those children in the study, by the time they are 8, have moved at least once in their lives. And so they are more likely to have to move if they're in rental accommodation. And of course, that means that they're also needing to move schools. So 70% who moved schools, and there were 20% who did, basically moved because they'd moved house. And so there's not only disrupting their home environment, it's disrupting the educational trajectory. And why does that matter? Well, because we could also look at 8, like we did in the preschool years, at what that persistent adversity or instability of home and school environment meant for wellbeing. And unfortunately, by 8, we were seeing those things exacerbated. So the things we'd seen at 4.5 had got worse for these children by 8. They had worse scores in depression and anxiety, and also in physical measures of wellbeing. So our next move is to say, what is creating resilience in that space, alongside the way we did with the 4.5, and start to do more with this work in terms of hearing from the children directly. So I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour in a quick few minutes of some of the things that we're doing in terms of translating evidence. The most important partnership, I want to acknowledge the families themselves. We couldn't do any of this without them. So as well as the partnerships with policymakers and communities, the most important partnership that keeps this going is the ones with the families themselves. And we're incredibly grateful for that. And really just ending with what I think is important for most of us probably on the call, that actually we can find some extraordinary things just from following these ordinary people's lives, which is a quote that's been perturbed somewhat, but taken from Helen Pearson's Life Project book, which is a fabulous read. So that's all from me. If anybody has any points of clarification, please just either raise your hand or ask in the chat. Otherwise, I will hand over to Emma in a second, and then we can come back